Okay, so good evening and welcome again to another live streaming of the basic transfer pricing Philippines, and we will discuss the OECD transfer pricing guidelines dealing with the transfer pricing method. No? So our discussion tonight will be the continuation of our discussions transactional and profit split method. No? But before that, I would like to say thank you po sa ating mga YouTubers and sa ating mga friends din po, sa ating mga viewers sa Facebook, no? So, ilan na yung ano natin sa YouTube?
Viewers tayo na 8 months sa YouTube po.
Okay.
Sa Facebook po, 6.
Okay. So, our last na discussion is about the profit split method, no? So, profit split method. So, tonight, continuation na po ito ng profit split natin. Okay? So, saan tayo nag-stop nung nakaraan on the guidance na, no? So, guidance for the application. Okay? So, this OECD transfer pricing guidelines, sa mga bago lang natin nag-tune in, ito po yung basis ng transfer pricing guidelines din po natin na inadapt ng Pilipinas, no? Sa international ito. At ano po ba itong sinasabi ng transfer pricing? Ito po yung pricing of goods and services in related party transactions, no? As applied to related party transactions. Ano yung principle adopted by the transfer pricing? Ito yung arm's length principle, wherein ang sabi po ng arm's length, kung ano yung transactions ng independent party, dapat comparable doon yung transactions ng related parties, because the independent party is the true benchmark or the true transactions, because there is no element of control. Okay? So, let's now go to the fifth transfer pricing methods. So, sa transfer pricing methods, we have discussed the first method, the comparable uncontrolled price method, and then the second is the resale price. The third is the cost plus method. Fourth is the transactional net margin method, and ito po yung last, yung profit split method. No? So, guidance for application. The guidelines do not seek to provide an exhaustive catalog of ways in which the transactional profit split method may be applied, no? So, itong guidelines, kumbaga sa binibigyan pa rin niya ng ibang pamamaraan na paano i-apply yung transactional profit split method, no? Application of the method will depend on the circumstances of the case and the information available, but the overriding objective should be to approximate as closely as possible the split of profits that would have been realized had the parties been independent in their prices. So, since sabi nga natin, ang transfer pricing, ang aim po talaga niya is to adapt and apply the arm's length principle. So, ang dapat, kung nag-profit split, naghati-hati man yung mga related parties, dapat inadapt niya yung arm's length, or sa paghatian ng profit, dapat kung ano yung arm's length or anong ginagawa ng independent parties, no? So, under the transactional profit split method, the combined profits are to be split between the associated enterprises on an economically valid basis that approximates the division of profits that would have been anticipated and reflected in an agreement made at arm's length, no? So, sa transactional profit split method, yung combined the profits, pagsamasamahin yung profits. Kaninong profits yan? Ng related parties or those who belongs to the group. Pagsamasamahin yan, and then split ng grupo based on the contribution or economically valid basis na dapat makatanggap naman ng benefits yung commensurate to the participation niya or contribution niya doon sa grupo, no? So, yun na yung sinasabi natin na arm's length, no? Kung ano yung participation niya, kung ano nararapat sa kanya, yun ang mapupunta sa kanya. Why very particular po dyan yung mga tax authorities Kasi yung share na mapunta doon sa isang grupo situated in a country, doon naman yung basis na magta-tax yung country, no? So, yung ating share of the profits nung isang participant or nung isang entity or isang corporation, nakadepende naman doon yung tax na makukolekta nung bansa na nandoon yung related party or yung entity, no? Okay. So, in general, the determination of the combined profits to be split and of the splitting factor should, ito yon, be consistent with the functional analysis of the control transaction under review and in particular reflect the allocation of risk among the parties. Kaya, pasok pa rin yung factors natin, no? Ano yun? The functions, assets, and risk, no? So, kung ano yung function niya, dapat yun din yung magiging factor in splitting the profit. At kung ano din yung allocation niya dun sa risk na mapunta sa kanya, dapat dun din magiging base yung kanyang share on the profit. No? Also, be consistent with the determination of the combined profits to be split and of the splitting factors, no? So, which would have been agreed between independent parties. So, paano din-determine yung combined profits? Dapat, ang ginamit na splitting factors, yung agreed upon by independent parties, no? Kasi kung related parties lang, dictated lang yun, controlled ang related parties, no? And also, be consistent with the type of profit split approach, contribution analysis or the residual analysis, or other ex-ante or ex-post approach as discussed in paragraph 2.124, 2.151 below. And also, dapat be capable of being measured in a reliable manner. So, dapat yun ang maging basis, valid basis ng splitting of the profits, no? Kasi bakit nag-i-split ng profit? Kasi di ba sabi natin related parties. And that related parties, may mga contribution sila doon sa overall profit ng company, no? Halimbawa, A, B, C yan, D, E, no? 5 sila, situated in different countries. Bawat isa may participation doon sa business ng parent na nasa kay A. Yung iba, service support lang, no? Pero ang pera talaga doon napupunta lahat kay A. So, lahat ng 4, wala silang kita. Ang kita na doon kay A dahil nandoon yung sales. Sila, manufacturing lang, services lang, no? Marketing. So, ano dapat? Since nandoon lahat yung kay A ang pera, dapat i-divide based on their participation, no? So, gagawa ng valid basis kung ano yung ginagawa ng independent parties, yun ang i-adapt ng related parties in splitting the profit. So, hindi pwede na cost plus reimbursement of expenses lang. Hindi pwede yon. Bakit? Kasi pagka reimbursement of expenses lang, walang kita yung country na kung nasaan man yung isang related party, no? So, wala siyang kita, wala siyang makolekta na tax, which should not be. Why? Kasi may significant presence naman, may operation doon yung isang company. So, it is just proper na meron din silang share on the profit. And also the country where the entity is present o gumagawa ng business, may share din doon sa tax na madiderive from the income ng related party, no? So in addition, if a transactional profit split method is used to set transfer pricing in controlled transaction or ex-ante approach, it would be reasonable to expect the lifetime of the arrangement and the criteria or allocation case to be agreed in advance of the transaction, no? So ito yung before pa may agreement na yung parties. The person using a transactional profit split method or taxpayer, tax administration should be prepared to explain why it is regarded as the most appropriate method to the circumstances of the case, as well as the way it is implemented. and in particular the criteria or allocation case used to split the combined profit. So sino ang magawa ng recommendation? Ay kung sinong gumamit ng transfer pricing report, no? Kung halimbawa yung gumawa nun, the tax authority, then dapat ma-explain niya na dapat talaga yung profit split. Or kung ang gumawa naman ng transfer pricing analysis report is the taxpayer or the entity under audit, siya din yung magbibigay ng reason kung bakit profit split yung dapat. At sabi na natin, when can you use the profit split method? Pagka the operation is highly integrated such that walang profit yung iba, nandudun na nakakonsentrate sa isang related party, and then yung iba are just doing services to that related party. No? Kaya dapat lang split the profit. Otherwise, isa lang yung magpa-profit, yung iba, puro reimbursement of expenses. No? Hindi papayag yung tax authorities na ganun lang yung mangyayari. The determination of the combined profits to be split and of the splitting factors should generally be used consistently over the lifetime of the arrangement, including during lost years unless independent parties in comparable circumstances would have agreed. No? Otherwise, and the rationale for using differing criteria or allocation case is documented, or if specific circumstances would have justified a renegotiations between independent parties, no? So, various approaches for splitting the profits. Paano i-split yung profit? There are a number of approaches for estimating the division of profits based on either projected or actual profits as may be appropriate, to which independent enterprises would have agreed, two of which are discussed in the following paragraphs, no? Yung dalawang method on how to split the profit, no? Or approaches. These approaches, contribution analysis and residual analysis, are not necessarily exhaustive or mutually exclusive. Pwedeng meron pang ibang approach. Okay, so let's start with the contribution analysis. Okay. So under a contribution analysis, the combined profits, which are the total profits from the controlled transactions under examination, would be divided between the associated enterprises based upon a reasonable approximation of the division of profits that independent enterprises would have expected to realize from engaging in comparable transactions. This division can be supported by comparables data where available. In the absence thereof, it is often based on the relative value of the functions performed by each of the associated enterprises participating in the controlled transactions, taking account of their assets used and risk assumed. So in cases where the relative value of the contributions can be measured directly, it may not be necessary to estimate the actual market value of its participants' contributions. No? So actually in my tax audit, nagawa ko na to, no? Na ang pinili ng entity dun sa transfer pricing analysis report niya is cost plus method. But since nung nakita ko, may mga intangibles involved na, may pinagpagamit ng mga software yung related party to another related party, and highly integrated, no? Ang Philippines, wala siyang income. Ang income nandun lahat sa isang party, no? Outside the Philippines. So, ang nirecommend ko talaga doon is profit split, no? Ako yung gumawa ng profit split para ang ginawa kong variable or yung basis ko is the number of employees, no? At saka yung active assets. Kasi pag tiningnan mo sa consolidated reports, ang pinakamaraming empleyado at pinakamaraming active assets na dito po sa Pilipinas. So, yung binigyan ko ng share na malaki, yung sa Pilipinas, of course. And then the accountant nagsabi na mag-avail sila ng mutual agreement procedure, yung arbitrary, no, resolution ng adjustment. Kasi bakit daw sila pabayarin pa ng tax dito, mag-adjust ng profit, samantalang na-report na nila yan doon sa parent company nila, bayad na rin yung tax, no? Sabi naman ng guidelines kung intentional yung shifting ng profit at dapat dito siya sa Pilipinas. Pero because of the control ng isang company, doon nila ni-report sa ibang bansa, then pwedeng ibalik yung profit na yan dito sa Pilipinas and taxed accordingly. No? Okay. So it can be difficult to determine the relative value of the contribution that each of the associated enterprises makes to the controlled transactions, no? And the approach will often depend on the facts and circumstances of its case. So in that case, yung ginawa ko, number of employees at saka active assets yung basis ko, no? Kaya nga sabi, depending on the facts and circumstances of the case. The determination might be made by comparing the nature and degree of each party's contribution of differing types. So for example, provision of services, development expenses incurred, capital invested, and assigning a percentage based upon the relative comparison and external market data. No? So section C, paragraphs 2.138 to 2.151 for a discussion of how to split the combined profits, no? Paano ba hati-hatiin yung combined profits, no? So, residual analysis, paano naman ginagawa yung residual analysis? Ibig sabihin, residue, tinanggal mo na yung iba, binigay mo na sa kung kani-kanino sila belong, and then yung matira, yun na lang yung pagkati-hatian, no? So, a residual analysis divides the combined profits from the controlled transactions under examination in two stages. In the first stage, each participant is allocated an arm's length remuneration for its non-unique contribution in relation to the controlled transaction in which it is engaged, no? Meron siyang unique na non-unique na contributions. So, bibigyan na siya ngayon nung share para doon, no? Ordinarily, this initial lang to kasi may kasunod pa, no? So, ordinarily, this initial remuneration would be determined by applying one of the traditional transaction methods of a transactional net margin method by reference to the remuneration of comparable transactions between independent enterprises. So, we always read down to the independent enterprises, how they deal about that situation or transactions. Thus, it would generally not account for the return that would be generated by any unique and valuable contribution by the participants. So in the second stage, any residual profit or loss remaining after the first stage division would be allocated among the parties based on an analysis of the facts and circumstances following the guidance as described at paragraphs 2.138 to 2.151 for splitting the combined profits, no? So yun yung gagawin. And then the alternative approach to how to apply a residual analysis could seek to replicate the outcome of bargaining between independent enterprises in the free market. So in this context, in the first stage, the initial remuneration provided to each participant would correspond to the lowest price, no? So lowest price. An independent seller reasonably would accept in the circumstances and the highest price that the buyer would be reasonably willing to pay. So any discrepancy between these two figures could result in the residual profit over which independent enterprises would bargain, no? So in the second stage, the residual analysis therefore could divide this pool of profit based on an analysis of any factors relevant to the associated enterprises that would indicate how independent enterprises might have split the difference between the seller's minimum price and the buyer's maximum price, no? So yung pool of profit, meaning lahat ng participants, meron silang kanya-kanyang profits, i-combine yun, and then, halimbawa, merong silang non-unique contributions, so pagkatapos na ma-combine, bibigyan na ng paunang share yung bawat participants, and then yung remaining, yun yung i-divide, no? In some cases, an analysis could be performed, no? Perhaps as part of a residual profit split or as a method of splitting profits in its own right by taking 2.130, no? The combined profits to be split in a transactional profit split method are the profits of the associated enterprises from the controlled transactions in which the associated enterprises are engaged. Siyempre, doon yun kukunin yung profits doon sa associated enterprises at meron silang pooling, no? Pooling, pagsamasamahin, combine yung profits na yan with the profits of other related parties or associated enterprises. The combined profits to be split should only be those arising from the controlled transactions under review, no? So, yung under investigation. In determining those profits, it is essential to first identify the relevant transactions to be covered by the transactional profit split. It is also essential to identify the level of aggregation, see paragraph 3.9 and 3.12, where a taxpayer has controlled transactions with more than one associated enterprise. It is also necessary to identify the parties in relation to those transactions and the profits to be split among them. No? So in order to determine the combined profits to be split, the accounts of the parties to the transaction to which a transactional profit split is applied need to be put on a common basis as to accounting practice and currency and then combined. No? So because accounting standards can have significant effects on the determination of the profit to be split, accounting standards should be selected in advance of applying the method and applied consistently over the lifetime of the arrangement. No? So see paragraph 2.121. Determining the combined profits to be split. So for general guidance on the consistency of the determination of the combined profits to be split, the financial accounting may provide the starting point for determining the profit to be split in the absence of harmonized tax accounting standards. No? So the use of other financial data, cost accounting, should be permitted where such accounts exist, are reliable, auditable, and sufficiently transactional. No? So in this context, product line, income statements, or divisional accounts may prove to be the most useful accounting records. No? So, starting point ng profit split, no? Applicable din, or we visit also the accounting standards, no? Okay. Or also we apply also the cost accounting, no? Kasi paano mo ba i-compute yung profit? Siyempre, for tax purposes, 'di ba yung profit natin is sales less cost of sales less operating expenses equals the net profit or net taxable profit. But for accounting purposes, there are differences, no? The permanent difference and the temporary difference. So, ano ba yung pinag-usapan dito na profit that should be divided? The accounting profit, hindi yung taxable profit, no? Kasi merong mga type of expenses or items na hindi naman taxable, but included siya dapat doon sa pag-split ng profit, no? Actual or projected profits. If the profit split method were to be used by associated enterprises to set transfer pricing in controlled transaction, an ex-ante approach, then each associated enterprise would seek to achieve the division of profits that independent enterprises would have expected to realize from engaging in comparable transactions, no? So depending on the facts and circumstances, profit splits using either actual or projected profits are observed in practice, no? So when a tax administration examines the application of the method used ex ante to evaluate whether the method has reliably approximated arm's length transfer pricing, then it is critical for the tax administration to acknowledge that the taxpayer could not have known what the actual profit experience of the business activity would be at the time that the conditions of the controlled transaction were established, no? So without such an acknowledgement, the application of the transactional profit split method could penalize or reward a taxpayer, no? So by focusing on circumstances that the taxpayer could not reasonably have foreseen. Such an application would be contrary to the arm's length principle because independent enterprises in similar circumstances could only have relied upon projection and could not have known the actual profit experience. No? See also paragraph 3.74. No? So yung tax administration, kagaya dito ngayon sa Pilipinas, meron na tayo yung ramong bawandas 2019 wherein subject na po sa audit and investigation yung taxpayers with related party transactions, no? Okay. So ano yung titingnan natin? The arm's length transfer pricing, no? Okay. In using the transactional profit split method to establish the conditions of control transactions, the associated enterprises would seek to achieve the division of profit that independent enterprises would have realized. No? Kasi kaya nga palagi yung benchmark natin is the independent parties. No? The evaluation of the conditions of the control transactions of associated enterprises using a transactional profit split method will be easiest for a tax administration where the associated enterprises have originally determined such conditions on the same basis. No? So the evaluation may then begin on the same basis to verify whether the division of actual profits is in accordance with the arm's length principle. No? So where the associated enterprises have determined the conditions in their control transactions on a basis other than the transactional profit split method, then the tax administration would evaluate such conditions on the basis of the actual profit experience of the enterprise. No? So ano ba yung actual profit experience? Ito yung result of operations na nangyayari sa enterprise or na-earn ng enterprise based on its accounting records or based on its report of actual performance. However, care would need to be exercised to ensure that the application of a transactional profit split method is performed in a context that is similar to what the associated enterprises would have experienced on the basis of information known or reasonably foreseeable by the associated enterprises at that time the transactions were entered into in order to avoid the use of hindsight. No? See paragraphs 2.12 and 3.74. Shout out?
Ma'am, may question na rin po.
O, sige.
Shout out po muna ma'am kay Ma'am Jill Maureen Hakalan.
Hakalan?
Hakalan.
Okay.
Jill Maureen Hakalan.
Okay, so shout out po sa ating viewer, no? Bago lang siya. Jen Maureen Hakalan. Okay. So, good evening po and thank you for watching.
Pati po kay Sir Kevin Monserrate.
Oh! Oh, good evening po, Sir Kevin, no? Talagang active din si Sir Kevin pagdating sa transfer pricing, no? Kailangan na, no? Dahil may audit na yung BIR sa transfer pricing. Okay. Napakasipag din na CPA.
Good evening din daw po sabi ni Ma'am Irish Nari.
Okay, our ano yan talagang palagi na nanonood sa atin, no? Shout out and good evening. Thank you for watching, Miss Iris Nario.
Ito ma'am, may tanong po ma'am galing kay Sir Mark Philip Ursua.
Okay, so shout out din also kay Mark Philip.
Sabi niya ma'am, magkano po penalty kapag di ka nakapag-file ng ITR? Kasi dalawa naging employer mo at di ka qualified sa substituted filing pero zero ang tax due.
Ako zero ang tax due. Ang ginagawa ng iba depende sa gross, no? Pero para ma-determine mo ng tama, pa-compute po natin yan sa Officer of the Day kung saan tayo po naka-register ng BIR. Pero ang sa iba kasi, ang ginagawa nila 1,000 pagka wala talagang tax due, no? Depende sa district kung nasaan ka, at saka depende sa compromise na titingnan nila. Minsan depende sa gross, kung masyado malaki yung gross mo. Pero karamihan talaga is 1,000 for the late filing.
Yun lang ma'am, yung tanong.
Okay? So, continue lang po tayo, no? In a way, matapos siguro natin tonight yung transfer pricing methods. And then, yung next topic natin would be comparability analysis. So, it doesn't matter, no? Or it doesn't mean that we are discussing transfer pricing at hindi na tayo welcome pa rin po natin yung mga tanong na hindi po related sa transfer pricing. Sasagutin din po natin sila. No? Okay. So, let's now go to the different measures of profits. Kasi dito sa profit split, napaka-importante that we determine the profits. At kaninong profits yun? Profits ng mga members of the group. No? Kung sino yung participant of the group, napaka-importante na ma-determine natin yung kanilang profits because yun ang i-combine natin and yun ang paghahati-hatian, no? And that paghahati-hatian is dependent on their participation, no? Doon sa how the profit was generated, no? So, generally, the combined profits to be split in a transactional profit split method are operating profits. Ibig sabihin ng operating profits, ito yung net income, no, sa ating financial statement, sa income statement. Applying the transactional profit split in this manner ensures that both income and expenses of the M&E are attributed to the relevant associated enterprise on a consistent basis. Bakit consistent? Kasi hindi pa iba-iba yung ating treatment so that hindi magkakagulo, no, na mag-iiba yung ating total. However, occasionally it may be appropriate to carry out a split of gross profits and then deduct the expenses incurred in or attributable to its relevant enterprise and excluding expenses taking into account in computing gross profits. No? So in such cases where different analyses are being applied to divide the gross income and the deductions of the M&E among associated enterprises, care must be taken to ensure that the expenses incurred in or attributable to its enterprise are consistent with the activities and risks undertaken there, and that the allocation of gross profits is likewise consistent with the placement of activities and risks. No? So, importante na may consistency. Why? Kasi kung ano yung basis mo, dapat consistent, like allocation of risk. Ito yung tinuturo natin sa comparability factors. Why? Kasi ito yung mga attributes, ito yung mga factors that will tell us ano ba talaga yung mga criteria that we are going to consider pag nag-compare na tayo. Kasi, di ba transfer pricing ito? So, anong ginagawa dito? Compare. Why? Because the arm's length principle compares the independent party transactions and the related party transactions. And it said that arm's length na ang true transaction is that of the independent party transaction. So, dapat susunod doon yung related parties. No? So, para malaman natin yung income that is going to be split, meron tayong mga bases, no? May mga valid bases tayo kung paano natin i-split ang profit. And of course, may mga consistency din tayo on the computation of the profit itself. Ano ba yung mga included na mga expenses at ano yung hindi, no? So, for example, in the case of an M&E that engages in highly integrated worldwide trading operations involving various types of property, it may be possible to determine the enterprises in which expenses are incurred or attributed. So, sino ba yung entities na nandun sa kanya yung operating expenses, but not to accurately determine the particular trading activities to which those expenses relate, no? So, pwede ba yun? Di ba dapat sa accounting meron tayong matching of cost and expenses, no? So, in such a case, it may be appropriate to split the gross profit from its trading activity and then deduct from the resulting overall gross profits the expenses incurred in or attributable to its enterprise, bearing in mind the caution noted above. So, kasi karaniwan, yung ini-split sa profit split is the net profit. But there are cases, sabi po dito, na hindi oobra, hindi practical ang net profit na yun ang split. So, kailan siya pwede or mag-deviate doon sa net profit to be split? Pwedeng gross profit ang split, no? Gross profit, split a gross profit. And then, sa trading company. And then, bawat isa na recipient nung share in the gross profit, kanya-kanya na silang deduct ng kanilang operating expenses. Especially if kung mag-split ka ng profit at yung iba, hindi pare-pareho yung operating expenses because of the nature of their functions na may pagkakaiba. So, in some cases, it is practical to split the gross profit and then each an individual participant should deduct its own operating expenses from the share of the gross profit of the group, no? So, ito yung sinasabi dito sa guideline. Question? Okay. How to split the profits? No? So, paano i-split yung profits in general? The relevance of comparable uncontrolled transactions or internal data and the criteria used to achieve an arm's length division of the profits. Kasi yung splitting of the combined profits should be arm's length. Yun ang aim po talaga ng transfer pricing. So, kung hindi siya arm's length, pwede siya disallow, no? So, to achieve an arm's length division of the profits depend on the facts and circumstances of the case. Kaya, always talaga yan, determine the facts and circumstances of the case because each and every case can be unique. No? It is therefore not desirable to establish a prescriptive list of criteria or allocation. Okay? Kasi mamaya yung isa present yung ganyang criteria, sa iba naman hindi. So, walang prescription on the list of criteria that will be used in allocating the profits. No? So, see paragraph 2.121 to 2.123 for general guidance on the consistency of the determination of the splitting factors. In addition, the criteria or allocation case used to split the profit should be reasonably independent of transfer pricing policy formulation. For instance, they should be based on objective data, sales to independent parties, not on data relating to the remuneration of controlled transactions, sales to associated enterprises, and be supported by comparables data, internal data, or both. Pakipatay yung aircon dito, Hari. Okay. Reliance on data from comparable and controlled transactions. No? Bakit tayo will rely or will use the data on comparable and controlled transactions? Kasi nga sabi natin, doon tayo nagbe-benchmark, no? Doon tayo nagko-compare, no? So, one possible approach is to split the combined profits based on the division of profits that actually results from comparable and controlled transactions. So, paano yun? Paano ginagawa ng independent or uncontrolled transactions yung pag-split ng profit, no? Example, possible sources of information on uncontrolled transactions that might usefully assist the determination of criteria to split the profits. Depending on the facts and circumstances of the case include joint venture arrangements between independent parties under which profits are shared, such as development projects in the oil and gas industry, pharmaceutical collaborations, co-marketing or co-promotion agreements. These are examples. Arrangement between independent music record labels and music artists, uncontrolled arrangements in the financial services sectors, and others. So, allocation case. In practice, the division of the combined profits under a transactional profit split method is generally achieved using one or more allocation case. So, depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, the allocation case can be a figure, 30 to 70 split based on evidence of a similar split achieved between independent parties in comparable transactions, or a variable, no? So relative value of participants, marketing expenditure, or other possible case as discussed below. So where more than one allocation case is used, it will also be necessary to weight the allocation case used to determine the relative contribution that its allocation case represents to the earning of the combined profit, no? So iba-ibang allocation case yung pwedeng gamitin. In practice, allocation case based on assets or capital, pwede rin, no? So halimbawa, yung capital ng ABC, magkakaiba sila. Mas malaki yung kay C, no? So kung i-base mo sa capital, mas malaki yung share ni C, no? Fixed assets can also be the basis. Intangible assets, capital employed or cost, no? Relative spending and or investment in key areas such as research and development, engineering, marketing, no, are often used. Other allocation case based, for instance, on incremental sales, head counts, number of individuals involved in the key functions that generate value to the transaction. Also, pwede ring time spent by a certain group of employees if there is a strong correlation between the time spent and creation of the combined profits. Number of servers, data storage, floor area of retail points, and others may be appropriate depending on the facts and circumstances of the transactions, no? So yung ang sabi ko sa inyo na yung ginamit ko when I audit, no, certain taxpayer and transfer pricing part related transactions niya, yung ginamit ko is the active assets and the number of employees kasi sila yung pinakamarami dito sa Pilipinas as compared doon sa ibang bansa. Kaya mas malaki ang share dito sa Pilipinas. I-open mo yung isang aircon, Hari. Asset-based allocation case, no? Asset-based or capital-based allocation case can be used where there is a strong correlation between tangible or intangible assets. Ito naman yung parang justification kung bakit asset yung gamitin natin na basis or capital, no? So, asset-based or capital-based allocation case can be used where there is a strong correlation between tangible or intangible assets or capital employed and creation of value in the context of the controlled transaction, no? So, see paragraph 2.151 for a brief discussion of splitting the combined profits by reference to capital employed, no? Kasi siyempre, pag malaki yung capital mo, malaki yung ginagamit mo sa operation, dapat lang din malaki yung share mo sa profit, no? So in order for an allocation K to be meaningful, it should be applied consistently to all the parties to the transaction, no? So dapat consistent to all the parties kasi mag-pool ka eh. I-combine mo sila, no? See paragraph 2.104 for a discussion of comparability issues in relation to asset valuation in the context of the transactional net margin method, which is also valid in the context of the transactional profit split method. So one particular circumstance where the transactional profit split method may be found to be the most appropriate method is the case where each party to the transaction contribute valuable, unique intangibles, no? So yan yung pwedeng isang consideration din natin. Kasi one party, may contribution siya na valuable or unique intangibles. Intangible assets pose difficult issues in relation both to their identification and to their valuation. Kaya nga, yung recognition and measurement of intangibles natin, no? Pwede lang natin i-recognize yung intangible if there is a basis na talagang nandyan siya, can be measured, and then can be measured, you know, recognize lang natin siya kung yung value niya can be measured at saka yung nandyan talaga yung existence niya. Kasi kung estimate lang o future period pa, hindi natin i-recognize yung intangibles. Okay. Identification of intangibles can be difficult because not all valuable intangible assets are recorded in the accounts, no? Sometimes you cannot find the intangible assets in the financial statement. Why? Kasi hindi siya ni-recognize. An essential part of a transactional profit split analysis is to identify what intangible assets are contributed by each associated enterprise to the control transaction and their relative value. So guidance on intangible property is found at Chapter 6 of these guidelines. See also the examples of the annex to Chapter 6, examples to illustrate the guidance on intangibles. No? So in the future, titingnan po natin yan at aralin natin yung guidance on intangibles. Why? Because nowadays, we cannot do away with the study of intangibles because intangibles are very important considerations in the study of transfer pricing and in the actual, yan din po ang nagkakaroon sila ng mga tax savings devices using the intangibles. No? So, cost-based allocation case. So, sa cost naman yung basis ng allocation, no? Siguro kung sino yung pinakamalaking cost, siya rin yung pinakamalaki ang share sa profit, no? An allocation case based on expenses may be appropriate where it is possible to identify a strong correlation between relative expenses incurred and relative value added, no? For example, marketing expenses may be an appropriate K for distributors, marketers, if advertising generates material marketing intangibles. No? In consumer goods, where the value of marketing intangibles is affected by advertising. No? So research and development expenses may be suitable for manufacturers if they relate to the development of significant trade intangibles such as patents. However, if, for instance, each party contributes different valuable intangibles, then it is not appropriate to use a cost-based allocation K unless cost is a reliable measure of the relative value of those intangibles. And then remuneration is frequently used in situations where people functions are the primary factor in generating the combined profits. No? So yun yung sa cost-based allocation K. No? Yung gastos mo, yun na yung ginamit mo na basis para mas malaki din yung share mo in the profit of the group. No? Cost-based allocation case have the advantage of simplicity. No? So it is, however, not always the case that a strong correlation exists between relative expenses and relative value as discussed in paragraph 6.142. One possible issue with cost-based allocation case is that they can be very sensitive to accounting classification of cost. Of course, kasi pagka ang isang expense or yung cost ni-reclassify mo, magiging iba na yung mukha ng iyong financial statement. Halimbawa, yung isang expense na classify mo siya as direct cost. So, ano yung magiging effect nun? Liliit ang gross profit. Pero pagka kinlassify mo naman siya as operating expenses, same pa rin ang gross profit. Ano ang liliit? Yung net income or net margin. No? So it is therefore necessary to clearly identify in advance what costs will be taken into account in the determination of the allocation K and to determine the allocation K consistently among the parties. No? So dapat lang consistent yung basis natin in dividing the profits. No? So timing issues. Okay. Another important issue is the determination of the relevant period of time from which the elements of determination of the allocation K, for instance, assets, cost, or others, should be taken into account. No? A difficulty arises because there can be a time lag between the time when expenses are incurred and the time when value is created. And it is sometimes difficult to decide which periods expenses should be used. No? So for example, in the case of a cost-based allocation K, using the expenditure on a single year basis, may be suitable for some cases, while in some other cases, it may be more suitable to use accumulated expenditure, net of depreciation or amortization, where appropriate in the circumstances, no? So incurred in the previous as well as the current years. So depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, this determination may have a significant effect on the allocation of profits amongst the parties. As noted at paragraph 2.122, 2.123 above, the selection of the allocation K should be appropriate to the particular circumstances of the case and provide a reliable approximation of the division of profits that would have been agreed between independent parties. No? So, yun yung timing issues are very important. Reliance on data from the taxpayers' own operations or the internal data. No? So, saan ka magre-rely ng data? Siyempre, from the taxpayers' own data. No? Unless otherwise, meron kang external data to prove. No? Where comparable uncontrolled transactions of sufficient reliability are lacking to support the division of the combined profits, consideration should be given to internal data, no? Which may provide a reliable means of establishing or testing the arm's length nature of the division of profits. No? So the types of such internal data that are relevant will depend on the facts and circumstances of the case and should satisfy the conditions outlined in this section and in particular at paragraphs 2.122, 2.123, and 2.138. No? So they will frequently be extracted from the taxpayer's cost accounting or financial accounting. So for instance, where an asset-based allocation K is used, it may be based on data extracted from the balance sheets of the parties to the transaction. No? It will often be the case that not all the assets of the taxpayers relate to the transaction at hand, and that accordingly, some analytical work is needed for the taxpayer to draw a transactional balance sheet that will be used for the application of the transactional profit split method. No? So similarly, where cost-based allocation K are used that are based on data extracted from the taxpayer's profit and loss accounts, it may be necessary to draw transactional accounts that identify those expenses that are related to the controlled transaction at hand and those that should be excluded from the determination of the allocation case. So mag-classify ka ngayon ng account, no? So the type of expenditure that is taken into accounts, no? So ito yung salaries, depreciation, ito yung operating expenses, as well as the criteria used to determine whether given expense is related to the transaction at hand or is rather related to other transactions of the taxpayer to other lines of products not subject to this profit split determination should be applied consistently to all the parties to the transaction. Kasi there might be transaction na hindi naman dapat kasali. Excuse me. See also paragraph 2.104 for a discussion of valuation of assets in the context of the transactional net margin method, where the net profit is weighted to assets, which is also relevant to the valuation of assets in the context of a transactional profit split, where an asset-based allocation K is used. No? Okay. Excuse lang po, sandali. Okay, so let's proceed, no? So, very careful po tayo when it comes to classification ng expenses na pwedeng i-deduct at hindi pwedeng i-deduct to arrive at the profit. Kasi bakit? Ang ini-split po natin dito is profit. So, any expense na i-apply natin or classify natin and i-deduct natin would have an effect to the profit that is going to be split by the group, no? So, careful tayo doon sa mga expenses na ikarga natin to arrive at the net profit, no? So internal data may also be helpful where the allocation K is based on a cost accounting system. So headcounts involved in some aspects of the transaction, time spent by a certain group of employees on certain tasks, number of servers, yung sa technology, no, yung sa mga computer, data storage. Pagka malaki yung data storage mo, data warehouse mo, ibig sabihin, malaki din yung contribution mo sa business, no? Floor area of retail points, no, kung retail. Internal data are essential to assess the values of the respective contributions of the parties to the control transaction. No? So, internal data, why? Kasi ito yung, sabi na natin, ito yung magiging basis mo in the computation of the net profit. The determination of such values should rely on a functional analysis that takes into account all the economically significant functions, no? So, ano pa? Assets and risks contributed by the parties to the control transactions. And in those cases where the profit is split on the basis of an evaluation of the relative importance of the functions, assets and risks to the value added to the control transaction, such evaluation should be supported by reliable objective data in order to limit arbitrariness, no? So particular attention should be given to the identification of the relevant contribution of valuable intangibles and the assumption of significant risk and the importance, relevance, and measurement of the factors which give rise to these valuable intangibles and significant risks, no? So very important. Functions, assets, and risks. So go back to 5 comparability factors. One possible approach not discussed above is to split the combined profits so that each of the associated enterprises participating in the control transactions earn the same rate of return on the capital it employs in that transaction. No? Sa transaction lang na i-split. No? Kasi possible din na may transaction din yung certain party na hindi naman dapat i-split kasi hindi siya integrated or sarili lang niya. This method assumes that each participant capital investment in the transaction is subject to a similar level of risk so that one might expect the participants to earn similar rates of return if they were operating in the open market. However, this assumption may not be realistic, no? Kaya facts and circumstances of the case pa rin is to be determined. So for example, it would not account for condition in capital markets and could ignore other relevant aspects that would be revealed by a functional analysis and that should be taken into account in a transactional profit split. No? Okay. So yun yung mga discussions natin about how to compute for the net profit. Na very important. Why? Because the net profit is the factor or is the important point of consideration natin because the profit should be split, no, according to the contributions of its entity or member of the group, no? So conclusions on transactional profit methods. Paragraphs 2.1 to 2.12 provide guidance on the selection of the most appropriate transfer pricing methods to the circumstances of the case. So take note, yung mga gumagawa ng transfer pricing analysis report, ito yung pwede ninyong basis ng explanation ninyo on the transactional profit methods. No, ano yung transactional profit methods natin? The transactional net margin method and the profit split method. No? So paragraphs 2.1 to 2.12 provide guidance on the selection of the most appropriate transfer pricing method to the circumstances of the case. As discussed in these guidelines, there are concerns regarding the use of the transactional net margin method, in particular that it is sometimes applied without adequately taking into account the relevant differences between the controlled and uncontrolled transactions being compared. No? So many countries are concerned that the safeguards established for the traditional transaction methods may be overlooked in applying the transactional net margin method. No? Thus, where differences in the characteristics of the transactions being compared have a material effect on the net profit indicators being used, then it would not be appropriate to apply the transactional net margin method without making adjustments for such differences. No? See paragraphs 2.74 to 2.81. No? The comparability standard to be applied to the transactional net margin method. No? Let's now go to ito na. No? The recognition that the use of transactional profit methods may be necessary is not intended, no, to suggest that independent enterprises would use these methods to set prices. As with any method, it is important that it be possible to calculate appropriate corresponding adjustments when transactional profit methods are used. No? So recognizing that in certain cases, corresponding adjustments may be determined on an aggregate basis, consistent with the aggregation principles in paragraph 3.9 to 3.12. So in all cases, caution must be used to determine whether a transactional profit method as applied to a particular aspect of a case can produce an arm's length answer. No? So you have to be careful. Either in conjunction with a traditional transaction method or on its own. No? The question ultimately can be resolved only on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the strengths and weaknesses set forth above for a particular transaction, for a particular transactional profit method to be applied. No? So the comparability, including functional analysis of the parties to the transaction, and the availability and reliability of comparable data. Kasi kung walang data, so how can you split? No? In addition, these conclusions assume that countries will have a certain degree of sophistication in their underlying tax systems before applying these methods. No? So, yan yung chapter 2 natin, that ended our discussion on chapter 2. No? And then we will go to comparability analysis. So, ano yung discussions natin sa chapter 2? We discussed about the transfer pricing methods, the 5 transfer pricing methods, yung comparable uncontrolled price method, which you use, which you compare the price, no? And the price is affected by the characteristic, no, of the product or services. And then we have the resale price method, no? Binili lang yung product, and then without adding so much value, binenta din ulit. And then compare the gross profit. Just like cost plus method, compare also the gross profit, no? And then we have the transactional profit method, which is the transactional net margin and the profit split method, no? So yun yung 5 methods that we discussed in chapter 2 of this OECD 2017 transfer pricing guidelines, no? May shout out at saka question?
Wala po, ma'am.
May shout out, wala ring nagdagdag? Okay, so let's have a break of 5 minutes. May question? Okay, so shout out ulit sa ating mga YouTubers and sa mga Facebook friends natin. Thank you for watching, no? So, this is a continuation of our discussion on transfer pricing guidelines, no, ng OECD. So, nasaan na tayo? Dito na po tayo sa chapter 3, which deals with the comparability analysis. At what I am telling you that comparability analysis is the heart of transfer pricing. Why heart of transfer pricing? Kasi kung balikan natin, what is transfer pricing? Transfer pricing is the transfer of goods and services between related parties, no? So, between parties. At anong batayan or ano dapat ang pag-transfer ng goods and services between the parties? Dapat ay naka-pattern siya or naka-benchmark siya sa independent parties. Why? Kasi ang sabi, ang independent parties, the commercial and financial transactions between independent parties are the real price because walang element of control and it is influenced only by the market forces. Samantalang related parties, may element of control. So, ano yung purpose ng transfer pricing? To determine if the price between related parties is arm's length or comparable to that of the independent parties. So, since sabi natin, the arm's length principle is being adopted that compares the independent transactions and the related party transactions, then ang masasabi natin that the heart of transfer pricing is the comparability analysis. You are going to compare the related party transactions and the independent transactions, no? So, kaya nga comparability ang tawag. At ano yung mga dapat nating i-compare, no? So, we will know it in this chapter 3, comparability analysis. So, performing a comparability analysis, the general guidance of comparability is found in section D of chapter 1 by definition, no? So, a comparison implies examining two terms, no? So, i-examine mo yung dalawa, no? The controlled transactions under review and the uncontrolled transactions that are regarded as potentially comparable. Kaya sa transfer pricing analysis, maghanap ka ng comparable, no? Yung independent transactions na doon mo i-compare yung related party transactions, no? At para sa akin yun ang pinakamahirap pag gumagawa ka ng transfer pricing analysis report. The search for comparable is only part of the comparability analysis. Part lang siya kasi pagka naghanap ka ng comparable, i-analyze mo pa yun and then i-compare mo using different factors, no? So, dapat kumpleto yung information mo. It should be neither confused with nor separated from the comparability analysis, no? So, iba yung comparables, iba yung comparability analysis, no? So, yung kino-compare mo, yun yung related parties and the comparable, which is the independent party. The search for information on potentially comparable uncontrolled transactions and the process of identifying comparables is dependent upon prior analysis of the taxpayer's controlled transaction and of the economically relevant characteristics or comparability factors, no? So, see section D.1 of chapter 1. A methodical, consistent approach should provide some continuity or linkages in the whole analysis process, no? So, thereby maintaining a constant relationship amongst the various steps, no? So, from the preliminary analysis of the conditions of the controlled transactions to the selection of the transfer pricing method, through to the identification of potential comparables and ultimately a conclusion about whether the controlled transactions being examined are consistent with the arm's length principle as described in paragraph 1 of Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention. No? So what is our aim, the ultimate aim, why we compare? In order to draw a conclusion that the related party transactions or the transactions that we are under examination are arm's length, no? So, consistent with the arm's length principle under Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention. Ano sabi ng Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Conventions, where transactions are made between related parties in their commercial and financial transactions which differ from those which would have been made between independent prices, then the financial or commercial transactions and the profits that accrues to one of the enterprises, but by reason of those conditions have not so accrued on that certain enterprise, then the tax authority may attribute the profit to the entity where it should belong and then taxed accordingly, no? So ibalik niya yung profit doon sa kung sino talaga yung may-ari and taxed accordingly. Doon na i-impose yung tax, no? So yung experience ko na yung taxpayer resolved to mutual agreement procedure kasi ang sabi niya kung mag-adjust tayo ng profit, yung profit na yan, bayad na yan doon sa ibang country, no? And that action would be tantamount to double taxation, no? Pero ang sabi naman ng transfer pricing, if the intention to shift the profit is intentional to evade payment of taxes, then sometimes double taxation is allowed, no? So pwedeng there is double taxation kasi intentional na ayaw mo magbayad ng tax dito sa Pilipinas and then yung tax na para sa Pilipinas binayad mo sa iba, so pwedeng may double taxation kasi parang penalty mo na yon na bakit yung para dito na tax ibinayad mo sa ibang bansa, no? Kasi you want to make savings, no? Kasi mas mababa yung tax sa ibang bansa. So as part of the process of selecting the most appropriate transfer pricing method, no? See paragraph 2.2 and applying it. The comparability analysis always aims at finding the most reliable comparables. Thus, where it is possible to determine that some uncontrolled transactions have a lesser degree of comparability than others, they should be eliminated, no? See also paragraph 3.56. This does not mean that there is a requirement for an exhaustive search of all possible sources of comparables, as it is acknowledged that there are limitations in availability of information and that searches for comparables data can be burdensome, no? So see also discussions of compliance efforts at paragraph 3.8 and 3.83, no? So in order for the process to be transparent, it is considered a good practice for a taxpayer that uses comparables to support its transfer pricing or a tax administration that uses comparables to support a transfer pricing adjustment, no? To provide appropriate supporting information for the other interested party, tax auditor, taxpayer, or foreign competent authorities to be able to assess the reliability of comparables used, no? So see paragraph 3.36 for a discussion of information available to tax administrations that is not disclosed to taxpayers. So general guidance on documentation requirements is found at chapter 5 of this guidelines. See also the annex to chapter 4, guidelines for conducting advanced pricing arrangements and the mutual agreement procedure, MAP or APAS. No? So what are the processes in the comparability analysis, the typical process, no? Below is a description of typical process that can be followed when performing a comparability analysis, no? So this process is considered an accepted good practices, but it is not a compulsory one, no? So suggested lang naman. And any other search process leading to the identification of reliable comparables may be acceptable as reliability of the outcome, no? Is more important than process. Going through the process does not provide any guarantee that the outcome will be arm's length, and not going through the process does not imply that the outcome will not be arm's length, no? So depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, no? So step 1, determination of years to be covered. Sa atin naman, no, dito sa Pilipinas, yung years to be covered, usually wala tayong independent na transfer pricing audit, kasama po siya sa regular audit. So, paano yung period covered usually sa investigation, sa tax investigation is 1 year, 1 taxable year. Step 2, broad-based analysis of the taxpayer's circumstances. No? So, broad-based analysis. That's why, sa bago nating requirements dito sa Pilipinas, which is Form 1709, as an attachment to the annual income tax return, nandoon na, can be used by the examiner in their broad-based analysis of the taxpayer circumstances. Why? Kasi nandun na lahat ng disclosures on related party transactions. And of course, kasama din doon yung documentation. No? So step 3, understanding the control transactions under examination based in particular on a functional analysis in order to choose the tested party where needed, the most appropriate transfer pricing method to the circumstances of the case, the financial indicator that will be tested in the case of transactional profit method, and to identify the significant comparability factors that should be taken into account. Napakaraming lamok-hari. Ko, pati likod mo, kinakagat. At saka paa. Ay, patayin mo. Okay. Step 4, review of existing internal comparables, if any. No? And then, determination of available sources of information on external comparables. No? Where such internal comparables are needed, no? Taking into account their relative reliability. No? Step 6, selection of the most appropriate transfer pricing method and, depending on the method, determination of the relevant financial indicator. No? Dali lang po. Okay. Step 6, selection of the most appropriate transfer pricing method and, depending on the method, determination of the relevant financial indicator. Ano po yung relevant financial indicator? Ito yung net profit indicator in case of transactional net margin method. Ano yung profit indicator doon? Kasi net margin yung ginagamit. No? Step 7, identification of potential comparables. No? So determining the key characteristics to be met by any uncontrolled transaction in order to be regarded as potentially comparable. No? Based on the relevant factors identified in step 3 and in accordance with the comparability factors set forth at section D1 of chapter 1. No? Step 8, determination of and making comparability adjustment where appropriate. And step 9, interpretation and use of data collected, no? Determination of the arm's length remuneration. So yun na yun. Pagdating mo ng step 9, ma-determine mo na yung arm's length price, no? Arm's length. How much really is the arm's length price, no? Kasi dito sa step 8, nag-adjust ka na, no? Okay. Dito naman sa step 7, identify mo na yung potential comparables, no? Sa step 6, na-select mo na yung transfer pricing method mo na gagawin. Sa step 5, nandun na yung mga information ng external at saka internal comparables. Sa step 4, na-review mo na yung existing na internal comparables. Why? Because huwag kalimutan yung internal comparables, they are very important, no? At saka ready na information na yan sa iyo. So bakit mo pa iiwanan, no? Understanding the control transactions, yun yung step 3. And then yung broad-based analysis ng step 2, nasabi ko yung BR Form 1709 will help a lot the BIR in making a broad-based analysis of the taxpayer circumstances, kung ano man siya, no? Step 1, yung year to be covered. Na dito naman sa atin, usually, 1 year, no? So in practice, this process is not a linear one, no? So step 5 to 7 in particular, linear one di naman siya kailangan na sunod-sunod, no? Step 5 to 7 in particular might need to be carried out repeatedly until a satisfactory conclusion is reached, no? So pwedeng repeated. Hindi pwede yung pagsabi mo na step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dire-diretso na, no? Yung iba pwede mong balik-balikan. The most appropriate method is selected especially because the examination of available sources of information may, in some instances, influence the selection of the transfer pricing method. For instance, in cases where it is not possible to find information on comparable transactions, step 7, in order to make reasonably accurate adjustments, step 8, taxpayers might have to select another transfer pricing method and repeat the process starting from step 4. No? See paragraph 3.82 for a discussion of a process to establish, monitor, and review transfer prices. No? So, pwede. Okay, broad-based analysis of the taxpayers' circumstances. No? The broad-based analysis is an essential step in the comparability analysis. It can be defined as an analysis of the industry, competition, economic and regulatory factors, and other elements that affect the taxpayer and its environment. No? But not yet within the context of looking at the specific transactions in question. This step helps understand the conditions in the taxpayer's controlled transaction as well as those in the uncontrolled transactions to be compared, in particular the economic circumstances of the transactions. So, yan yung broad-based analysis ng taxpayer circumstances. So, saan ka mag-uumpisa? Sa functions, no? The industry. Kung anong klaseng industry nandun siya. So, review of the control transaction and choice of the tested party. No? So, review of the control transactions under examination aims at identifying the relevant factors that will influence the selection of the tested party, no? Kung kailangan. The selection and application of the most appropriate transfer pricing method to the circumstances of the case. The financial indicator that will be tested in the case of transactional profit method, the selection of comparables, and where relevant, the determination of comparability adjustment. Kung kailangan, diba, kailan ba tayo dapat mag-adjust pagka merong hindi similar ang independent party at saka yung related party, no? So, kung pwedeng gawa ng comparability ng adjustment to make them similar, then gagawa na ng transfer pricing analyst ng adjustment, no? So, yun talaga yung purpose. I-adjust mo na para pagdating ng transfer pricing audit, hindi na magkaroon ng adjustment, no? So, evaluation of a taxpayer separate and combined transactions, no? So, sa separate and combined transactions, ito na siguro yung magkaroon tayo ng segmented na financial statements, no? Kasi sa combined financial statements or consolidated, nandun na lahat. So, if the examiner wanted to have some specific information on a specific line of business, then the taxpayer or the entity will be required to prepare a segmented financial statement. Kaya yun yung update namin kanina on the PSTRI at saka Tax Advisors Group na based pa lang doon sa recording ninyo, be specific na with your recording, taking into account yung future na preparation ng segmented financial statement. So, ibig sabihin lang, segmented na rin yung recording nyo. So that pag hiningan kayo ng information, segmented financial information, hindi na kayo mahirapan, no? So, evaluation of a taxpayer separate and combined transactions, no? Ideally, in order to arrive at the most precise approximation of arm's length conditions, the arm's length principle should be applied on a transaction by transaction basis. Kaya nga, transaction by transaction basis. Kasi magkukompare ka eh, no? So, however, there are often situations where separate transactions are so closely linked or continuous that they cannot be evaluated adequately on a separate basis. No? So examples may include some long-term contracts for the supply of commodities or services, rights to use intangible property, and pricing a range of closely linked products, no, in a product line, when it is impractical to determine pricing for each individual product or transaction. Another example would be the licensing of manufacturing know-how and the supply of vital components to an associated manufacturer. So it may be more reasonable to assess the arm's length terms for the two items, no? So together rather than individually. Such transactions should be evaluated together using the most appropriate arm's length method. A further example would be the routing of a transaction through another associated enterprise. It may be more appropriate to consider the transaction of which the routing is part in its entirety, rather than consider the individual transactions on a separate basis. So see example 26 of the annex to chapter 6. Another example where taxpayers' transaction may be combined is related to portfolio approaches. Portfolio approach is a business strategy consisting of a taxpayer bundling certain transactions for the purpose of earning an appropriate return across the portfolio rather than necessarily on any single product within the portfolio. Ano yung bundling? Pagsamasamahin mo yung product, no? So, for instance, some products may be marketed by a taxpayer with a low profit or even at a loss because they create a demand for other products. Yun yung bundling, naka-attach doon yung product. And or related services of the same taxpayer that are then sold or provided with high profits. No? So, example, equipments and captive aftermarket consumables, no? Such as vending coffee machine. Mura lang yung coffee machine. Saan sila tutubo? Sa coffee capsules na i-supply nila doon sa bumili ng vending machine kasi hindi mo magamit yung vending machine kung hindi ka bibili ng coffee capsules. Or printers and cartridges. Mura lang yung printer, saan sila tutubo? Ang company, sa cartridges. Why? Kasi hindi mo magamit yung printer kung walang cartridges. No? So similar approaches can be observed in various industries. No? Portfolio approaches are an example of a business strategy that may need to be taken into account in the comparability analysis and when examining the reliability of comparables. No? So see paragraph 1.114 to 1.118 on business strategies. No? So ano itong mga business strategies? Ito yung comparability factors. No? However, as discussed in paragraphs 1.129 to 1.131, this consideration will not explain continued overall losses or poor performance over time. So, moreover, in order to be acceptable, portfolio approaches must be reasonably targeted as they should not be used to apply a transfer pricing method at the taxpayer's company-wide level in those cases where different transactions have different economics, logic, and should be segmented. Sige po. So while some separately contracted transactions between associated enterprises may need to be evaluated, no? Together, may sound? Okay. Wala tayong shout out? Walang.
Pero may tanong, ma'am.
Sige, walang. Sige. Go muna tayo sa question, no, bago tayo mag-proceed.
Tanong po ma'am ni Ma'am Irish Nario kung
Okay.
ano daw po yung accrued expenses.
Yung?
Accrued.
Accrued expenses. Ito yung na spend mo na, and then parang dinifer mo pa siya, no? Yung deferred assets, inaccrue mo na. Ibig sabihin, kahit na hindi mo pa siya nagawa ng expenses, pero inaccrue mo na, recognize mo na, no? So accrued na expenses. Halimbawa, accrued rent, no? Accrued ano pa ba yung ibang expenses na ina-accrue, no? So, di-recognize mo na yung expense, pero hindi pa mo pa siya actually na disbursed, no? Okay? Meron pa? Oh, sige, no? So, diretso lang po tayo sa comparability analysis, no? Actually, itong comparability analysis, ito na yung kumbaga sa mga functions, no? Pag sa overall ng transfer pricing, ito na yung cream of the crop na functions or na anong tawag dito? Yung ginagawa na. Kasi nandito na yung result eh. Kaya nga nag-compare ka na eh. No? Kasi after the comparability, nandun na yung adjustment. No? So, parang dito mo na nakikita yung resulta na nagta-transfer pricing analysis ka. No? Okay. While some separately contracted transactions between associated enterprises may need to be evaluated together in order to determine whether the condition are arm's length, no? Other transactions contracted between such enterprises as packaged may need to be evaluated separately. No? So an M&E may package as a single transaction and establish a single price for a number of benefits, such as licenses for patents, know-how, and trademarks, the provision of technical and administrative services, and the lease of production facilities. No? This type of arrangement is often referred to as a package deal. No? Such comprehensive packages would be unlikely to include sales of goods. However, although the price charged for sales of goods may cover some accompanying services. No? So in some cases, it may not be feasible to evaluate the package as a whole, so that the elements of the package must be segregated. No? So in such cases, after determining separate transfer pricing for the separate elements, the tax administration should nonetheless consider, no, whether in total the transfer pricing for the entire package is arm's length. No? So even in uncontrolled transactions, package deals may combine elements that are subject to different tax treatment under domestic law or an income tax convention. No? So for example, royalty payments may be subject to withholding tax, but lease payment may be subject to net taxation. No? Yung sa atin, itong lease, ito yung rental, subject din siya sa withholding tax na 5%. No? So in such circumstances, it may still be appropriate to determine the transfer pricing on a package basis, and the tax administration could then determine whether for other tax reasons it is necessary to allocate the price to the elements of the package. No? So in making this determination, tax administrations should examine the package deal between associated enterprises in the same way that they would analyze similar deals between independent enterprises. No? So taxpayers should be prepared to show that the package deal reflects appropriate transfer pricing. No? So yung sabi natin na package deal, no? Mga transactions between the related parties. No? Intentional set-offs. An intentional set-off is one that associated enterprises incorporate knowingly into the terms of the controlled transactions. No? Knowingly. So, ibig sabihin, nasa terms, nasa kontrata. It occurs when one associated enterprises has provided a benefit to another associated enterprises within the group that is balanced to some degree by different benefits received from that enterprise in return. So, nag-set off na lang sila ng mga benefits that they both give and receive to each other. Kaya nga set off. These enterprises may indicate that the benefit each has received should be set off against the benefit each has provided as full or part payment for those benefits, so that only the net gain or loss, if any, on the transactions needs to be considered for purposes of assessing tax liabilities. No? So, for example, an enterprise may license another enterprise to use a patent in return for the provision of know-how in another connection and indicate that the transaction result in no profit or loss to either party. No? So, pwedeng ganon. Walang loss or profit sa other party. No? Hindi nila ni-recognize yung gain. Such arrangement may sometimes be encountered between independent enterprises and should be assessed in accordance with the arm's length principle in order to quantify the value of the respective benefits presented as set-offs. No? Intentional set-offs may vary in size and complicity. So, ano yun? Size and complicity. So, depende sa laki, no? And kung complicated ba siya. Such set-off may range from a simple balance of two transactions, such as favorable selling price for manufactured goods in return for a favorable purchase price for the raw material used in producing the goods, no? So, ano yun? Yung related parties, yung isa siya nag-supply ng goods, yung isa siya naman yung nagpo-purchase ng product manufactured by the one who purchased the goods, no? So, sila lang. Independent so, to an arrangement for a general settlement, balancing all benefits accruing to both parties over a period. No? So, independent enterprises would be very unlikely to consider the latter type of arrangement unless the benefits could be sufficiently accurately quantified and the contract is created in advance. Otherwise, independent enterprises normally would prefer to allow their receipts and disbursements to flow independently of each other, taking any profit or loss resulting from normal trading. Okay, so recognition of intentional set-offs does not change the fundamental requirement that for tax purposes, the transfer prices for controlled transactions must be consistent with the arm's length principle. No? So it would be good practice for taxpayers to disclose the existence of set-offs intentionally built into two or more transactions between associated enterprises and demonstrate or acknowledge that they have relevant supporting information and have undertaken sufficient analysis to be able to show that after taking account of the set-offs, the conditions governing the transactions are consistent with the arm's length principle. No? Okay. So, it may be necessary to evaluate the transactions separately to determine whether it satisfy the arm's length principle. If the transactions are to be analyzed together, care should be taken in selecting comparable transactions and regard had to the discussion at paragraphs 3.9 to 3.12. So, we're still talking on the intentional set-off. The terms of set-offs relating to international transactions between associated enterprises may not be fully consistent with those relating to purely domestic transactions between independent enterprises because of the differences in tax treatment of the set-off under different national tax systems or differences in the treatment of the payment under a bilateral tax treaty. No? So, we're talking still of intentional set-off, no? So, na pwedeng magkaiba, especially if the set-off involved different parties situated in different countries with different tax authorities. So, nagiging complicated. For example, withholding tax would complicate a set-off of royalties against sales receipts, no? Kasi yung royalties, yun yung payment for the use of intangible, is kagaya dito sa Pilipinas, that is subject to 20% final tax, no? Some other country might have a different treatment or tax imposed on royalty. A taxpayer may seek an examination, a reduction in a transfer pricing adjustment based on an unintentional over-reporting of taxable income. Tax administrations in their discretion may or may not grant this request. No? So tax administrations may also consider such request in the context of mutual agreement procedures and corresponding adjustment. No? So ito naman yung chapter 4. No? Right now we are on chapter 3. No? So what are the choice of the tested party? When applying a cost plus resale price or transactional net margin method as described in chapter 2, it is necessary to choose the party to the transaction for which a financial indicator or markup on cost, gross margin or net profit indicator is tested. No? So the choice of the tested party should be consistent with the functional analysis of the transaction. As a general rule, the tested party is the one to which a transfer pricing method can be applied in the most reliable manner and for which the most reliable comparables can be found. No? Kasi, papaano mo gamitin yung isang comparable na wala ka namang information? No? So, hindi siya pwedeng gamitin. Hindi siya reliable. It will most often be the one that has the less complex functional analysis. No? So, yun yung tested party. This can be illustrated as follows. Assume that company A manufactures two types of products. Product 1 and product 2. No? So ito yung example. That it sells to company B, an associated enterprise in another country. Assume that A is found to manufacture P1 products using valuable, unique intangibles that belong to B and following technical specifications set by B. Assume that in this product 1 transaction, A only performs simple functions and does not make any valuable, unique contribution in relation to the transaction. The tested party for this product 1 transaction would most often be A. No? Assume now that A is also manufacturing product 2 products for which it owns and uses valuable, unique intangibles such as valuable patents and trademarks, and for its B acts as a distributor. Assume that in this product 2 transaction, B only performs simple functions and does not make any valuable, unique contribution in relation to the transaction. So the tested party for the product 2 transaction would most often be B. No? Samantalang yung sa product 1, sino yung tested party doon? Si A. No? Information on the control transaction. So, in order to select and apply the most appropriate transfer pricing method to the circumstances of the case, information is needed on the comparability factors in relation to the control transaction under review, and in particular to the functions, assets, and risks of all the parties to the control transaction, including the foreign associated enterprise. So specifically, while one-sided method or cost plus resale price or transactional net margin method, which are discussed in detail in Chapter 2, only require examining a financial indicator or profit level indicator for one of the parties to the transaction, the tested party. As discussed in paragraph 3.18 to 3.19, some information on the comparability factors of the control transaction and in particular on the functional analysis of the non-tested party is also needed in order to appropriately characterize the control transaction and select the most appropriate transfer pricing method. No? So, where the appropriate transfer pricing method in the circumstances of the case determined following the guidance at paragraphs 2.1-2.12 is a transactional profit split, then financial information on all the parties. We have discussed already the profit split. So, financial information on all the parties to the transaction, domestic and foreign, is needed. No? So, bakit needed? Kasi compare mo sila. No? So, you cannot compare without that information. Given the two-sided nature of this method, the application of a transactional profit split necessitates particularly detailed information the foreign associated enterprises or enterprise party to the transaction. No? So this includes information on the 5 comparability factors in order to appropriately characterize the relationship between the parties and demonstrate the appropriateness of the transactional profit split method. No? As well as financial information, the determination of the combined profits to be split and the splitting of the profits both rely on financial information pertaining to all the parties to the transaction, including the foreign associated enterprise. No? Accordingly, where the most appropriate transfer pricing method in the circumstances of the case is a transactional profit split, it would be reasonable to expect that taxpayers be ready to provide tax administrations with the necessary information on the foreign associated enterprise party to the transaction. No? So including the financial data necessary to calculate the profit split. See Chapter 5. Okay. Where the most appropriate transfer pricing method in the circumstances of the case determined following the guidance at paragraphs 2.1-2.12 is a one-sided method. No? One-sided method. Financial information on the tested party is needed in addition to the information referred to in paragraph 3.20, irrespective of whether the tested party is a domestic or foreign entity. So if the most appropriate method is a cost plus, no, resale price, or transactional net margin method, and the tested party is the foreign entity, sufficient information is needed to be able to reliably apply the selected method to the foreign tested party and to enable a review by the tax administration of the country of the non-tested party of the application of the method to the foreign tested party. No? On the other hand, once a particular one-sided method is chosen as the most appropriate method and the tested party is the domestic taxpayer, the tax administration generally has no reason to further ask for financial data of the foreign associated enterprise outside of that requested as part of the country-by-country or master file reporting requirements. No? See Chapter 5. As explained above, transfer pricing analysis necessitates some information to be available about foreign associated enterprises, the nature and extent of which depends especially on the transfer pricing method used. However, gathering such information may present a taxpayer with difficulties that it does not encounter in producing its own information. This difficulty should be taken into account in developing rules and or procedures on documentation. Okay. So, tapusin lang natin to, no? It's comparable uncontrolled transactions in general, no? So, a comparable uncontrolled transaction is a transaction between two independent parties that is comparable to the controlled transaction under examination. No? So, it can be either a comparable transaction between one party to the controlled transaction and an independent party or the internal comparable, or between two independent enterprises, neither of which is a party to the controlled transaction. Ito yung external comparable. No? So, external, wala talaga silang transaction with related parties. Pero yung internal, yung related parties, may transaction with that of the independent parties. Sa external, pareho silang independent, no? Yung parties. Comparison of taxpayer-controlled transactions with other controlled transactions carried out by the same or another M&A group are irrelevant to the application of the arm's length principle and therefore should not be used by a tax administration as the basis for a transfer pricing adjustment or by a taxpayer to support its transfer pricing policy. Oh. The presence of minority shareholders may be one factor leading to the outcomes of a taxpayer's controlled transactions being closer to arm's length, but it is not determinative in and of itself. No? The influence of minority shareholders depends on a number of factors, including whether the minority shareholder has a participation in the capital of the parent company or in the capital of a subsidiary, and whether it has and actually exercises some influence on the pricing of intra-group transactions. No? Okay, so internal comparables. What are internal comparables? No? So step 4 of the typical process described at paragraph 3.4 is a review of existing internal comparables, if any. No? So ito yung sabi kong internal comparables, ito yung may transaction and associated enterprise with the unrelated party, if any. So internal comparables may have a more direct and closer relationship to the transaction under review than external comparables. No? The financial analysis may be easier and more reliable as it will presumably rely on identical accounting standards and practices for the internal comparable and for the control transaction. So in addition, access to information on internal comparables may be both more complete and less costly. No? So on the other hand, internal comparables are not always more reliable, and it is not the case that any transaction between a taxpayer and an independent party can be regarded as a reliable comparable for control transactions carried on by the same taxpayer. No? So internal comparables, where they exist, must satisfy the 5 comparability factors in the same way as external comparables. See paragraph 1.33, 1.118. No? So guidance on comparability adjustments also applies to internal comparables. See paragraph 3.47, 3.54. Assume, for instance, that a taxpayer manufactures a particular product, sells a significant volume thereof to its foreign associated retailer, and a marginal volume of the same product to an independent party. So in such a case, the difference in volumes is likely to materially affect the comparability of the two transactions. Kasi magkaiba yung volume, may effect yan, no? Can be may discount, no? May economies of scale. So if it is not possible to make a reasonably accurate adjustment to eliminate the effect of such difference, then the transaction between the taxpayer and its independent customer is unlikely to be a reliable comparable. So you reject the comparable kung hindi mo pwedeng i-adjust yung kanilang differences. No? External comparables and sources of information. So there are various sources of information that can be used to identify potential external comparables. So ano yung potential external comparables? No? This subsection discusses particular issues that arise with respect to commercial databases, foreign comparables, and information undisclosed to taxpayers. So ano itong mga data coming from commercial databases? Ito yung mga nagme-maintain ng mga data or information ng mga clients or ng mga entities na accumulate nila yung mga data to be available to third parties pero may bayad, no? So nagbebenta ng data. Ano naman itong mga foreign comparables? Nakukuha sa foreign source, no? And information undisclosed to the taxpayers. Ito yung mga nakuha ng tax authorities na mga information about the taxpayers from the third party, pero hindi siya alam ng taxpayers na meron ang tax authorities, no? So additionally, whenever a reliable internal comparables exist, it may be unnecessary to search for external ones, no? So kung meron ng available internally, hindi na kailangan ng external, no? So what are these databases? A common source of information is commercial databases which have been developed by editors who compile accounts. Ito na yung gahanap sila ng sources na information and then kino-compile nila. Filed by companies with the relevant administrative bodies and present them in an electronic format suitable for searches and statistical analysis, no? And their data can stand scrutiny in court, no? Kasi talagang pwede nilang panindigan na tama talaga yung data nila. They can be a practical and sometimes cost-effective way of identifying external comparables kasi mahal, no? And may provide the most reliable source of information depending on the facts and circumstances of the case. A number of limitations to commercial databases are frequently identified because these commercial databases rely on publicly available information. They are not available in all countries since not all countries have the same amount of publicly available information about their companies. No? So moreover, where they are available, they do not include the same type of information for all the companies operating in a given country because disclosure and filing requirements may differ depending on the legal form of the company and on whether or not it is listed. No? So depende doon sa private companies at saka yung publicly listed companies, madali lang maghanap ng information on the publicly listed companies kasi available siya in public. Sa mga websites, pwede ka nang kumuha. Pero yung mga private, pahirapan, no? Pahirapan. And then sa ECE ngayon, dapat magbayad ka. Care must be exercised, lalo na ngayon na may Data Privacy Act, no? So hindi nila basta-basta binibigay yung mga information. Care must be exercised with respect to whether and how these databases are used, given that they are compiled and presented for non-transfer pricing purposes. No? So it is not always the case that commercial databases provide information that is detailed enough to support the chosen transfer pricing method. Not all databases include the same level of detail and can be used with similar assurance. No? Importantly, it is the experience in many countries that commercial databases are used to compare the results of companies rather than of transactions because third-party transactional information is rarely available. See paragraph 3.37 for a discussion of the use of non-transactional third-party data. May question, Hari?
Meron po, ma'am.
Okay, sige. Question muna tayo.
Galing po, ma'am, kay Purple Bright Star.
Wow, ang ganda naman. Purple
Bright
Bright
Star.
Star. Good evening.
Sabi niya, ma'am, ano po usually ginagamit na transfer pricing method ng MNEs that render professional consultancy business?
Services, no? Services yan. Usually in practice is cost plus method, no? Cost plus method yung parang reimbursement of expenses and then mag-a-add sila a certain markup, no? Kasi services yan. Pero depending yan on the facts and circumstances of the case. Kaya nga sabi nila, wala yung prescribed na method, but kung gawan mo siya ng transfer pricing analysis, lalabas na kung ano ba talaga siya, no? Kasi may thorough na analysis at saka may available information. Pero kung based lang talaga sa simpleng classification lang, pag services, karamihan dyan is profit split, is cost plus method. Pero para sa akin na, kasi I undergo also na nag-audit ako ng services, no? Depending on the facts and circumstances, I recommend the profit split method, no? Kasi highly integrated eh. Kaya services lang siya, pero highly integrated yung sistema ng pag-generate ng income. So, ang ginawa ko, I recommended the profit split method. And under our Revenue Regulations 2-2013, our transfer pricing guidelines in the Philippines, ang sabi dyan, use all the methods, no? I-apply mo lahat ng methods and then recommend the best method, or that is what we call as the best method rule, no? Magre-recommend ka ng best method, pero i-apply mo muna lahat ng methods, which is the 5 methods, kasi we adhere to the OECD transfer pricing guidelines, no? Meron pa?
Yun lang po, ma'am.
Okay, so tapusin ko lang to, ha. Okay. So it may be unnecessary to use a commercial database if reliable information is available from other sources, So internal comparables where they are used, commercial databases should be used in an objective manner, and genuine attempts should be made to use the databases to identify reliable, comparable information. No? Use of commercial databases should not encourage quantity over quality. Bakit quantity? Napakarami po ng data or information sa database. No? Millions ang data. In practice, performing a comparability analysis using a commercial database alone may give rise to concerns about the reliability of the analysis. Given the quality of the information relevant to assessing comparability that is typically obtainable from a database. No? So to address these concerns, database searches may need to be refined with other publicly available information, depending on the facts and circumstances. No? Such a refinement of the database search with other sources of information is meant to promote quality over standardized approaches and is valid both for database searches made by taxpayers, practitioners, and for those made by tax administrations. So it should be understood in light of the discussion of the cost and compliance burden created for the taxpayers at paragraph 3.80 to 3.83. No? So there are also proprietary databases that are developed and maintained by some advisory firms. Yun yung pumunta sa akin dito sa Pilipinas from Japan na they are maintaining their own databases. And that is, they made it available to me, pero siyempre magbabayad ka. No? Kasi may gastos din yung kanilang maintenance ng database. In addition to the issues raised above for commercial databases that are more broadly commercialized, proprietary databases also raise a further concern with respect to their coverage of data if they are based on a more limited portion of the market than commercial databases. So when a taxpayer has used a proprietary database to support its transfer prices, the tax administration may request access to the database to review the taxpayer's results for obvious transparency reasons. So in this case, pwedeng tingnan ng tax authority yung source mo na database. And siyempre, gobyerno, the database cannot refuse for authenticity purposes. Kasi pwedeng tingnan ng tax authority yung database kung tama ba o saan nanggagaling yung kanyang information for the authenticity also of the information. And sabi dito, for transparency reasons. No? So, may question pa?
Wala.
Ilan yung sa YouTube?
YouTube po may viewers po tayo na 5.
Sa YouTube, Facebook.
po 8.
Okay. So, with that, thank you very much sa mga YouTubers natin at sa mga friends natin sa Facebook. Thank you very much for watching and let's call it a night. Thank you very much.